أهلا وسهلا بالجميع. صباح الخير, مساء الخير, wherever you are. I'm Lara Shiha. Welcome to Psychic Militancy. I'm so excited to have Mohamed with me today. He's the author of this incredible book from Iskra. Make sure you grab it. Politically Unconscious, the Psychic Aftermath of the Sudanese Revolution. We're going to get into it, folks. I promised you an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, reading both of Sudan and also my brother here is right in my wheelhouse around psychological issues. And we were just talking about how we need a full rehaul of everything imperialist and white supremacist in the field. So I'm very excited to get into it. Before we get started, you know the drill. Like, subscribe to YouTube channel. Send this to a comrade, like it during the stream. YouTube has been particularly vicious on our channel in suppressing stuff. Anytime anything that mentions any one of our countries in the title, it goes downhill from there. So you all know what to do. We also have a Patreon. Make sure you become a member. Pre-releases. This will go out on audio to everybody who's a patron before it goes to all the other audio channels. So without further ado, Mohamed, ahla wa sahla feek. Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Hello. Assalamu alaikum. I hope you're doing well. I hope everyone's doing well. It's really good to be here. We're just talking behind screen, and yeah, yani, it's an honor, and it's I've been like listening to this podcast for a while, and it's really great to be here.
Thank you.
A little bit nerve-wracking, but to be live, but hopefully we do a good job.
We'll try to we'll ease you into it. This is a no stress zone, as you know. There's no gotcha moments, no stress, conversational. Yeah. So I mean, how are you doing? How are things? Let's start there. Well, then we'll ease into it. I have some questions I've prepared for Mohamed after reading the book. Again, folks, I'm gonna link the book itself so that you all can grab a copy. But let's start with how you're doing. How has it been? How has the book been received? How have you been doing? All the things.
Wallah, alhamdulillah, yani, everything is like, it's been surreal to receive it. I think we spoke briefly before coming on, but yani, it's been so surreal to receive it because yani, at least from my experience, like writing a book, it's a mixture of like hard work and a little bit of luck and the right time and the right place and all these kinds of things. When you're, shout out to Iskra for like putting me on and publishing the book and all of that, and especially my editor Raoul, who's really cool and stuff like this. But receiving, I don't know, writing the book and then receiving like some praise and stuff like that is kind of surreal. But so far, all good. Waiting for the other shoe to drop or waiting for like the criticisms to come. But so far, alhamdulillah, it seems to be received well by people. Maybe there's like maybe it doesn't speak about me personally, but like the lack of books or knowledge about what's going on in Sudan, that might be, why it's being received this way.
Yeah. Well, as somebody who read the book, I think it's partially you too, about how you wrote the book, your how you frame it. But I agree with you. I think it's the particular moment. I think as we've been subjected to the ferocity of empire and violence, particularly in the last 3 years, and I see and I hear people searching for Sudan in that and how to think about it and trusted voices around that. So maybe this is a good place to start. Like for people who've not yet read the book, maybe you could walk people through important historical configurations that are necessary to know and understand the texture of the revolution, the leftist underpinnings. And I think this is something that you do so well in the book. So folks, there's some case studies here. We're going to get into that about psychological case studies and your own theory of psychotherapy praxis, but you start off the book really introducing the reader in a very accessible way about the history of Sudan. And then also you're kind of unbending and laying out the conditions that lead us to this moment, which I think is really important because sometimes, what oppressors do is sort of drop us into a moment in time. And in fact, you warn us of this. You're just like, every time you see Sudan being covered, it's like a moment in time that is disconnected from this larger historical pattern. And of course, that ends up feeling overwhelming. And then what I hear all the time is people go, well, I don't know what to think about it, or this is too big, or this is too complicated, or whatever the case is. But you do a fantastic job. So I'm wondering if you could let our audience know a little bit of that sketch, historically, materially, geographically, and then of course psychologically, like what leads us to this moment. Are you there? I think we may have lost connection just for a second. Let me see if Mohamed is back. That's all right. But for folks, I dropped the link to the book in the stream. Yeah, I think he froze. We'll have him back soon. But just so you all know, he starts off, I mean, the book, this is the thing that I found super helpful.
For sure,
are you back? Mohamed, are you back? Oh, all right. I think he's going to jump back in. As I was saying to you all, so what I find really helpful is this sort of breakdown in a really accessible way. I think one of the things that I've noticed over and over again about Sudan is that, of course, we're seeing a sort of amplification of the violence that's happening. We know the UAE is implicated in this. There was a revolution. This is what the space of the revolution itself. And then we also know, as many revolutions happen, there's state capture. There's a way in which the revolution is co-opted both by state actors and then by external forces like NGOs and sort of a certain class of people. And one of the things I love about Mohamed's book is he walks us through and is thoroughly sort of rooted in a class analysis, both in terms of giving us a read and a lay of the land of sectarianism and the way that sectarianism works. And I think this is sometimes what I see people staying a little bit away from with Sudan, because they're just like, well, I don't know what side, and there are tribes and there's sects and there's different sort of variations of things. So I think people get overwhelmed or a little bit worried to sort of go there. But what he does is sort of lay it out. And what I hope when he's back, we'll be able to talk about the ways that sectarianism also in a nationalist discourse end up being spaces where revolutionary fervor get captured, get pulled into things. And then we lose sight of the actual analysis that we need to really do justice to what's happening in Sudan, both historically, like what led up to this moment. And I think this is one of these books that, does such a great job with laying out a comprehensive history that is very inaccessible. It's not a long book. I got through it in 2 days, and it's very easy to get into, but doesn't also shy away from walking us through the various moments and the various steps of what led us to this particular moment. And then in between, of course, he also peppers in his own practice. So he was a psychotherapist practicing during the revolution, and then walks us through that as well. But again, like anything that you all know on this show, there's something that I'm very specific about, is like, how do we locate any particular moment in a larger condition? And I think that's the thing that Mohamed does really well. And so I'm hoping that he's going to be able to join us, to come back on and join us. I'm not sure if he just lost connection. Oh, he told me that his laptop overheated. So he's in Germany. So that is quite interesting for me that the laptop overheats in Germany, but that's okay. He'll be joining us. I did want to read to you all something where actually I will show you also, one of the things that he does is he goes through and gives us an entire chapter. Well, part two, he splits it into part one, part two, and part three. Part one is like the historical context that we're talking about, with a specific focus on anti-communist and class analysis, which I'm going to get into with him as well, about how does anti-communism really play into all of this. And that might be important for us because we're seeing this moment in like real, high contrast dye, let's say, everywhere in the world, where we're starting to see the ways in which an anti-communist approach really underlies most of the reactionary or anti-revolutionary movements, and then of course the discourse of empire. And so I think those of us who might have been interested in the history of Sudan or know a little bit about it might know that that was also central to the counter-revolutionary processes and forces in Sudan. But a lot of people that I talked to actually have no idea that there was a rich, thriving communist and socialist history of Sudan. And in fact, that's precisely what was targeted and what ended up happening, and sort of certainly in bringing in the revolution, but also the targeting of it. And prior to that, the precedents that sort of led up to that are a vicious and predatory anti-communist approach to Sudan, which again, might not be a surprise to any of us at this moment. But when you're sort of having an eye on something and being able to take it up and analyze it in a particular way, it's really important for us to locate that. Oh, and here's Mohamed. Back on track.
Yeah.
I was just giving a sort of overview of the book and also a sneak peek to where we're going to be going. But
Okay.
Are you good? Is your computer good?
Yeah, sorry. I'm so sorry about that. For some reason, my computer
All
decided
good.
it was the perfect moment to to crash out.
It's always like that. It's always like that.
Yeah.
Something tells me the German state is like, wait a second. This is the moment. He's going to get into some shit. We're going to talk about communism. This is not the time to let you go. Well, we had started, for folks who joined us, I was just setting up for Mohamed to ask him to help us understand historically, materially. He gets into the psychological elements of it, but just to walk us through like the backdrop of the book. And you do this, again, I want to say, is you do this really well, where you're just like, I actually can't write this book without telling you this history that is always sort of downplayed or taken in small pieces or overlooked or purposefully displaced. So I want to give you a chance, kind of give that framing to people who haven't yet read the book.
For sure. I mean, I think what we stopped off earlier is that, when you said, for example, whenever there's conversations about Sudan, there's like a thirst to know more, and there's almost like a sort of, I don't know, like, and I think I don't. There's almost like not, things are repetitive, like, you know what I mean? Like, there's always like these binaries that are repeated, like, the military versus the paramilitary. There is Burhan versus Hemeti. There's like Darfur versus and there's always these sort of patterns that are repeated. But a meaningful history, like, it is available maybe, but like you have to excavate it, you have to put in effort, but it's not immediately available, I think, when we talk about Sudan. And you're absolutely right. Like, we do need to contextualize what's going on, where these sort of antagonisms came from. And I think the reason why folks out there, and I think a lot of people want to know the context of this, is because you don't want to fall into like sort of a liberal, sort of humanist position, right? Because then you only see Sudanese people in the sense of like, in a certain light. Right. You don't make sense of it. It's just like they're deserving of our empathy purely by being like these sort of victimized people. And like, if that's an image that's stuck into your head about Sudan, then when you sort of start to contextualize what's going on in Sudan based on these sort of very colonial thinking, which is like, before the UAE stepped in and like, funded this group, they were living in like this, people don't say this overtly, but like, tinges of like the noble savage. You know what I mean? Where everything was okay in Sudan, blah blah blah, but then the UAE came in and everything exploded. Well, that's not exactly the case. So I like, you know, there is a need to understand this history, and more importantly, I think for us as well, like in Sudan, and for anyone who's you know, wants to be part of like a change and a meaningful change in Sudan, we need to know how to change things, and in order for us to change things, we need to know what's going on. And finally, what you said is absolutely correct, and I think, you know, something that is yeah, one of the reasons why I've written this book is because I cannot make sense of the current moment, and I think really you can't make sense of the current moment except by understanding its history and how it relates to us.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then to go into it, to answer your question more directly, I think in the book, just briefly to sketch it out, you can start it at any time when this history came about, right? So for example, you can start it with like the 2018, 2019 revolution, you know, there's a moment of revolt, but the working classes, or like, you know, these forces, the popular forces, of which I was one, we were not prepared, and so it was stolen by the more organized forces, which is like typically what you hear from the left. You can start from like the moment that many people following Sudan hear about, which is like the genocide in Darfur in 2003, 2005, and stuff like this, and how like integral the destruction of Darfur is to like the destruction of the entire country. And you see similar patterns in the same forces that destroyed Darfur. People go back to the dictatorship of 1989 and Omar al-Turabi's dictatorship, Omar al-Bashir's dictatorship, the one that we overthrew in 2019. It came to power and thing. And so for me personally, I started, you know, at a particular period that I haven't seen it being covered, which I found a little bit strange, or you know, the history of Sudan not starting from this particular point, which is 1973. Of course, 1973, for many listeners, you know, it's, you know, the Yom Kippur Ramadan war, where the Zionist entity sort of devastated the Arab nations. And, you know, we you know, this history is sort of hashed out elsewhere and stuff like this. But, you know, I talk about how when after defeat of the Arab forces, they divested from the West, and then they invested into Sudan as a breadbasket of, you know, of North Africa and that part of the world, basically, for various geographical reasons and stuff like this. Sudan is literally underneath Egypt and like across the sea, across the Red Sea from like Saudi Arabia. So geographically, it had the potential to do this. It's a large country.
Quite important
yeah.
geographically. You know, that's the thing you can count on with colonizers and imperialists. They always try to fuck with the best land, the most strategic place, right? And then want to kind of disappear the reason why, right? And then build in narratives why. But I interrupted you. Sorry. Go ahead. So we're in the 1970s.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, they were looking for a place, and, you know, Sudan at the time was the biggest country in Africa. You know, the 10th, 11th, you know, 9th biggest country in the world. It's a big country, you know, like, you know, the part of Darfur, the part called Darfur that we hear about in the news is as big as like Germany. So it's a huge, you know, it's not a small country. So they invest in there, and you know, immediately we think in our heads, right? Like pummeling a lot of money into a country, into a state, seems to be like a good idea. It's like investment. The problem with this is that what is the money used for? And what it was used for, it wasn't to upskill the workers or complicate the production process and like, you know, industrialize in a certain way, but rather when you create cash crops, what you do is you destroy the topsoil, so agrarian subsistence, and you sort of make sure to enrich those people who enfranchise these companies, like companies that they bring abroad. And the funny thing is, while they say that they've divested from the West, actually they indirectly invested into the West again, because they gave the money to like these Sudanese capitalists who basically brought in like Mercedes or Mitsubishi or various Caterpillar, I don't know, various like sort of, you know, global minority companies,
Right.
or you know what I mean. And so you see like this trajectory. When this happens, it puts into place like this mechanism where simultaneously you are degrading the mode of subsistence, not even the mode of production, but the mode of subsistence of like the mostly agrarian Sudanese population. You're simultaneously not industrializing and complicating the production process, not upskilling the labor, like making sure that there's only a one place, a centralized sort of form of wealth through like this capitalist class formation. And basically pushing off cash crops like these other nations, and making sure that these nations also, through their investments, they have like large enclosures. In Sudan, there's like a crazy picture. Maybe I should have added it to the book, but maybe I can link it some other time. But it's a crazy picture where you see the biggest land enclosures in Sudan actually belong to like, I don't know, Gulf companies and national funds and all these kinds of things. And basically the reason why I started from there is, when we revolted in 2018, 2019, we knew perfectly well, and maybe we're going to get into this later on about the irrational revolution. We knew perfectly well that, what we like, there's no tomorrow. Like tomorrow is not guaranteed. And the funny thing about it is, like, under capitalism, we live under this sort of understanding that history progresses forward. And so we don't rebel because, like, we've been taught in school, I mean, from a young age, right? I mean, I think this might be a little bit wild, but like, think about it this way. Like, when you see like parents disciplining their children, they're disciplining them not because they did something wrong, but because so that they don't develop a pattern for the future for them
for later.
Like, you know what I mean?
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right.
Exactly. You know what I mean? And so it's embedded in us, like, especially in this mode of production, the capitalism, to think about history always as progressively. During the Sudanese Revolution, we're like, actually, history seems to be regressing, and it's been regressing for such a long time, and we don't have any guarantees for the future. And this was sort of like a rallying cry, you know what I mean? Like, in front of our eyes, there was like, it's like that in a lot of places, but in Sudan, it was just so stark. And, we had nothing we didn't have the ideological sort of like it broke completely. The social contract broke completely. Like there's a and so I wanted to understand, where did it break from? And that moment in 1973 is where I started these sort of processes where, I go into them in the book in more detail about how, like, it sort of basically, devastated, like, future generation prospects and aspirations and stuff like this.
Right. Right. Well, and what I really appreciated is that you really focus on this reconfiguration, number one, of property relations, about the way that property relations mediate all of this, how it gets consolidated in particular ways, how a very specific class of people captured this, but then gets sold under a different banner, and the systematic degradation of the poor and agrarian class, right? The sort of dismissal of them entirely, which is again, feels like, to those of us who are Marxists or sort of in this, we're like, well, yeah, of course. But I have rarely seen this angle really be applied to Sudan, particularly when we're understanding where we are today. So can you say a little bit more about, like, what are those what are the things in 1973 what you were looking at? I mean, I know because I read the book, but some people who haven't yet read the book, what are the sort of hallmark things you were looking at that had this cataclysmic effect of catapulting Sudan into a particular space? I mean, I know, and neoliberal reform and all these sorts of things, but what are the specifics for people that they should know and pay attention to and keep in mind anytime we're looking at Sudan today?
Yeah, I mean, what I look at, I think, is specifically, I focus on what you said, like the property relations. And in 1973, this is when sort of things really intensified when it comes to property relations. So what I mean by this is, basically, for me personally, like, there's always a definitional debate about what capitalism is and how it sort of reproduces itself in our societies and different epochs and all these kinds of things. So it's I don't know, it's a little complex. But for me personally, I understand capitalism through property relations, not through wage labor, not through certain ideologies, whatever, but through specifically property relations. What I mean by this is basically, on property relations, I think sometimes people think it's like just renting to landlords and stuff like this, but it goes deeper than this, right? So, for example, one of the anecdotes that I give is people sort of negotiate with land, and how their ownership of land is negotiated, it's mitigated by social relations and the relation to the land itself. So, for example, let's say I'm a pastoralist, right? Now, I need to go from different places depending on the season, and take the herd of whatever animals I have with me, and across the way I need to feed them in certain locations. Now, when I go into different places, I sort of enter into negotiations with like different groups who, like, they don't have deeds to the land, but like they've reproduced themselves through this land, so they have a connection to it. They have a certain form of ownership to this land. Like, it creates an entire ecosystem where, for example, we can agree to come at certain times so that it can, and you can see this still happens till this day in like some regions around the world, of course, where I come at the early September or whatever. Like, it depends on the animal, it depends on like the what the farmer is farming. And so I eat what's left over after the harvest, and I simultaneously, my animals sort of like turn the soil, basically. You know what I mean? And so it's like an ecosystem mixed with like the social relations and so on and so forth. And it gets a little bit more complicated. And then, with like marriages and like, certain, like it gets like into like a real ecosystem. Of course, there's property relations and there's ownership, but this ownership is not conceptualized in the same way. There's like a social relations that's like deeply, and obviously rituals and all these kinds of things. What capitalism does, it comes and it defines property relations based on sort of improvement and waste. And you can see this clearly with colonialism and imperialism, right? Where they come, I don't know, to Turtle Island or America, and they're like, well, the people living here, they waste the land. They don't improve it as much as the British whatever do, or whatever it is. And so they come and they try to like, well, they do not try to exterminate and like they genocide the population. And with it, they destroy a lot of things. Not just the people, the livelihood, nature, social relations, but also it goes beyond this. For example, I love the book of David McNally, his new book in Capitalism and Slavery, where he gives the examples. He gives the example that when they go to Ireland, or when you go, even in Sudan they did this, but he used the example in Ireland. They went and they asked for the deeds. Now imagine you're in Sudan, right, and you have like this complicated relationship to the land, to the social relations, to the pastoralist, and there's like marriages, and there's all the like rituals and so on and so forth, and even like religious discourse and religious practices are like informed by these relationships to land and all these kinds of things. You know what I mean? And then you come and as like under these capitalist property relations, you ask for the deed of the land. And then when you ask for it, obviously no one, like the pastoralists, don't have like a contract saying like it just doesn't happen, right? And even the people who have lived there maybe generations, they don't have deeds to the land, and they don't even know where the parameters of the land is, because what the government does is comes and literally by centimeter or by meter or by like very precisely this from this and to this new sort of epistemology of land, which is like even like how we measure it, it's brand new. Like back then it used to be like, for example, I don't know, like in some places, take a rock, fling it where it lands, this is this corner. Take that rock and fling it in the other direction. And that's just how people used to be, because land, it had to be informed by the social relations. Going back to so capitalist property relations comes and like transforms this, not just at a material level, at like a epistemic level, even at an ontological level, all that kind of stuff. And then 1973 after Sudan was given like this investment from like the Gulf countries, the dictatorship at the time, Numeri, what he did was he intensified this process of capitalist property relations.
Yeah.
And this is where you see like just so much shit happen, right? Like, because more than the British, he goes around and basically says, where's the deed for this land? And the reason why he's asking, of course, is because no one has a deed, and he wants to basically lay claim to certain land so that they can buy it with the investment that they got from like these Gulf countries and so on and so forth. It is quite devastating. I mean, just to give like a sort of like a more intimate example, right?
Yeah.
When we talk about dispossession from land, I've got one of my cousins, for example, in this war, people became more dispossessed, and so they had to like move into like even smaller quarters and like bundle together, and it was like quite dangerous. Allah yarhamu, he had like a son who was like 1.5 years, right? And his son basically was playing around, and and when you're in such close quarters, you sort of, and things are devastating, your modes of subsistence and reproduction and all these kinds of things you need to search. So the adults are like busy trying to do something, like trying to find like ends meet and trying to see what was that to come tomorrow, whatever it is that like they're busy, and also at the same time feeling the devastation, like being aware of the devastating outcomes of the war and tending to one another and so on and so forth. So the children are not sidelined, but like they're left to their own devices, so to speak. They're like engaged with each other. And his child, he was playing, and accidentally, while he was playing with his other brothers and sisters, he sort of fell into like what's it called, a water container, and he drowned. Allah yarhamah, he drowned. And why I say this anecdote is because we tend to think of it, like devastating it sounds like logical to think about it like devastating the land of subsistence, but it's not just that. You have to imagine how much like the amount of indirect death and destruction that brought about, that trickles throughout time and place, is quite disturbing. Maybe I'll stop here and we can get into like more details of that later. But yeah.
No, I think this is so important because you're talking about the concentric circles of effect, right? Of a reconfiguration of an entire infrastructure of being, right? So we just think, oh, capitalism came and then here's property relations. And what you're walking us through is like, look at the ripple effects of an entire system that, by the way, tends to move faster because capital can move freely, whereas people don't. And so the catch up also that ends up happening. But one of the things that I really appreciated about the book is you hammer home throughout, and even in your cases, I mean, maybe there's a case that you mentioned about dispossession of land and displacement also, right? A family that was sort of displaced and then forced to leave the country, like in like many of the of our peoples that this sort of system is reconfigured. But then this is precisely what ends up happening, right? Is that there's these ripple effects that on the one hand, we don't think about, and on the other hand, have a huge impact to this current moment where we're still sort of tracking and tracing all the ways that this particular moment ended up happening. But you mentioned and you hammer, this is the part that you hammer home, that this is a class issue, that there's a certain class of people that banded together irrespective of their positions. Or a lot of times when I hear people, I had said this when your computer went kaput. I had said that a lot of times when people are talking about Sudan, they do so delicately with like, oh, and tribal relations and this and that, and people are this and all this sort of stuff. But what you come together is like, if we're reading it in this way, irrespective of all of that, there's a class of people that are interested in this change, despite the fact, by the way, that you also mentioned that Islam has a communal process. Like you could have gone that way. You could have gone the way of the waqf. You could have gone the way of communal property. You could have gone. So it's not even having to invent a new way, but this retelling and coming back to the idea of like a class of people that banded together, and that's why it's a collusion, a complicity with forces from Gulf money or all of that. Is like, you can look, oh, how do you, you know, sell your people under the bus? Well, because you're not of the same people, you're of different classes. And I think this is something that you do really well. I don't know if you want to say something about the specificities of that class configuration.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe here, maybe I think there's a resonance and a dialogue between my people and your people, and like, you know, generally in you know what I mean, that region is.
Yes.
I read a lot of books, right? And I don't want to throw shade or something, but about Sudan. And
shade is welcome.
but you know, like they use certain words as analytical tools just to bypass any meaningful analysis. Like they use the word, as in Sudan, they use the word like Islamist or Islamism and stuff like this. And wallah, I don't know. I don't know what the word means till now. I've read it in like maybe literally every single book I've read about Sudan has to have like the word. I don't know. It's like a conspiracy between all these authors or something like this, but has to have like a word like describing like what's going on in Sudan, like in this fashion. And there's a lot of words that are used as like to describe these countries. And I think you're absolutely right. But what I try to do in this basically in the book is to go beyond this, because it just does not make sense. I mean, even if you say, for example, people are motivated by like their religious views or whatever, like what the Sudanese government has done for like in the name of religion is nothing in comparison to like what the United States have done in the name of like in like Zionist, Christian Zionism or whatever. You know what I mean? It's really like, but we don't consider it that way because it doesn't make sense. But then this is used all the time. And, you know, for me personally, I think even unfortunately, this kind of discourse you see on the left as well, unfortunately, even in the left in Sudan as well, you know, unfortunately, you know, of course, hopefully we'll overcome with this book and with like, you know, other people who are doing great work into this. Shout out deep, I can't remember, but the book called Islamophobia after 9/11 or something like this. But there's a lot of people that do this really interesting work to denaturalize this. What I try to do in the book is basically look at it from a class perspective, because that's the only way it sort of makes sense. Of course, you don't disregard, you know, the racial dynamics and stuff like this, but you sort of bring them together and how like they're both, but you can't use religion as like the driving analytic of what's going on in Sudan, because then it just doesn't make sense and you sort of marginalize a lot of different things. For the book, for example, I say how we have to understand what's going on today as like exactly what you said. The capitalist classes of Sudan have, you know, and the capitalist classes in the Gulf countries and so on and so forth, and the capitalist classes within, you know, North Africa and West Asia. Basically, they've all, like, you know, in Lebanon, for example, this is particularly sort of salient, and like maybe something you can even see with I can't remember the previous prime minister. What's his name? Hariri or something.
Hariri, yeah.
Hariri,
the one who was kidnapped by Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. But like you see, for example, the capitalist classes of all these countries, whether it's Tunis, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Sudan, whether it's Lebanon, whether it's all these capitalist classes, they congregate into like the hub of accumulation in sort of you know, the Gulf countries. Adam Hineya, exceptional sort of scholar in this field, writes a book called Money Markets and Monarchies, who he looks at these sort of relationships, and there's just no doubt that the solidarity between the capitalists that sort of accumulates in like the Gulf countries is just driving a very, very violent process of dispossession and destruction and so on and so forth. And I think it does us a disservice, for example, when we look at it just from a religious angle, and I think in this moment specifically, we need to be mindful of this pattern. Because when you hear about Sudan, I don't know about you, Lara, but when you read about the various sort of papers and articles, it's always like Hemeti versus Burhan. Burhan is the representative of the Sudanese army. Hemeti is the representative of the paramilitary forces. And like this, it seems to be like an antagonistic relationship. But if you look at, for example, and people say that Hemeti is being funded by the UAE and so on and so forth. But in fact, the UAE and the Saudi capitalists and the Kuwaiti capitalists, so on and so forth, they're the ones who have been enclosing land in Sudan, destroying agrarian life, basically urbanizing people. And then even those urbanized people, because there's not an industry to go to in like the urban centers such as Khartoum, try to even have to go to like the circuit goes back. They go to Saudi Arabia, work as modern slave under the kafala system, right?
Yes.
And what's it called? And all of this is literally overseen by these same capitalist classes, and it's so it's just conspired by these people. So to say that, for example, Hemeti is like the person who's right now like exploiting this, no, like what the destruction of Sudan has been for the working classes and the agrarian classes and the progressive forces and so on and so forth in Sudan has been at the hands of the people for a long time. And if we are serious about tackling what's going on in Sudan, we can't think about tackling Sudan without tackling and abolishing basically the sort of capitalist classes in Sudan and in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia and so on and so forth.
Yes.
And Lebanon, of course.
Yes, it's the pan revolution here. We're down with all the capitalist classes, but this is really important because, again, it can seem so simple, but to come back to the basic thing that there was a condition that created this. When you see these antagonistic forces and it's what's set up, and this is what's sort of fed to us, particularly by mainstream news. I mean, that should be your clue that there's such a clear cut, distinction. And nobody's saying that there isn't destruction or atrocities that are being committed. We're not saying that. But to sort of think about the ways in which this clean-cut antagonism, there's an entire condition that precedes this to come into being, and that there are, let's say, alliances, class alliances that are made, and who's, of course, getting the boot of that. So maybe this is a good segue for us to talk about sectarianism and nationalist, because one of the through lines in your book are the ways, and then of course leading into the revolution, that these are some of the hurdles that you all confronted, is what are the ways that like nationalist discourses on the one hand, but then also sectarianism become these catch-alls, right? And they become, and for me, they're counterinsurgent, of course, because they siphon off revolutionary energy and people, and hide the class issues that you're talking about. Because it's not, I mean, nationalism can become the thing that then we're rallying behind, but then it hides all the class issues. Like the Sudanese, capitalist is not the same thing as the Sudanese agrarian. Just like in Lebanon, the billionaire class is not the same thing as somebody living in Dahieh or a displaced person or ethnically cleansed person. Just because they're both Lebanese and belong to a nationalist sort of idea, there's nothing that's similar to them, because they have different interests. They have entirely different means and capacity and relationship to the means of power and reproduction, all the stuff that we know. But maybe in the context of Sudan, if you can give a little more texture to folks who haven't read the book yet about, on the one hand, nationalism, on the other hand, sectarianism, and how that comes to play a part in, especially leading up to the revolution or during the revolution too.
For sure. I mean, I think everything that you said, 100%. You know what I mean, 1,000%. The question of nationalism and the question of sectarianism, like, I think it's a hot topic. I think on the left seems to be always, but like it's something. I don't know where it comes from. Not the confusion, but like there are like nationalist thing. But maybe to contextualize a little bit more, I'd say where it comes from Sudan historically, like at the moment of colonialism, and then a little bit later on. the national question in Sudan sort of came in the early 20th century under the British colonial administration of Sudan. And basically, naturally, when you have like a force coming in and they sort of claim superiority, claim sort of governance based on sort of, I don't know, the sort of basically the differences between you and I. You know what I mean? So I'm British, and let's say I'm different than you for various reasons. At this moment, this is when sort of the question of nationalism, for example, comes along, which is sort of like, okay, these people are coming to indiscriminately sort of destroy Sudan and Sudanese people and so on and so forth. Or not destroyed, but like sort of govern it and so on and so forth. And so in this moment, you have like a lot of sort of national zeal, which is like, okay, we need to all unite together to defend this whatever country and against, you know, the colonial powers. And in that sense, you have sort of, for example, you know, calls to we only want administrators who are Sudanese. We want independence, national independence, and we want this and we want that, and all these kinds of things. When in the book, when I talk about this period specifically, I do mention, I always mention this dude. I'm like the fanboy or whatever. Allah yarhamu, what's his name? Abdul Khaliq Mahjoub. And Abdul Khaliq Mahjoub basically, who is like one of the significant figureheads of like the Sudanese Communist Party. What he did was at the time, and I think this is sort of brilliant, is he preempted Frantz Fanon in his reservation to work with the sort of the national bourgeoisie, or what was known as the national bourgeoisie, or the elites, you know, to for the sole purpose of trying to have like independence. Mm-hmm. For Mahjoub, he sort of not only theoretically and like understood this or like tackled this or challenged this, but obviously but also practically, which is I think an important point. Instead of focusing on nationalism being the main thing, he actually thought that if we go forward and nationalism becomes the main thing, he says after independence, it's going to dilute the communist movement in Sudan. But not only that, it's going to sort of, we're going to be dependent on like these sectarian parties. You know what I mean? And, great insight. But great insight that is difficult to come by, right? I mean, even Frantz Fanon sort of warned about it. It's like, yo, guys, you need to chill a little bit. You need to after. You know what I mean? We don't know what's going to happen afterwards. But he had the foresight that I think for me is a really really insightful thing. Not only that, he focused more so on like women liberation and like the peasant movements and student movements and so on and so forth. And he said that the reason why, and he connected it maybe practically. I haven't read him saying this, but more practically he connected this with like we in our party, the Communist Party at the time, the independence in Sudan is 1956, so around that time. So he was like, in our party we have a real problem, not just by like linking with like sectarians for only national liberation, but the position of the party itself is like this bourgeois sort of, people who hate the religious poor because they think like they're sort of have like a false consciousness and all this kinds of nonsense. Mm-hmm. And we can't do this. We need to see where people are at, and we need to understand people. They take from them what we are, and just be part of that movement and so on and so forth. And I think his wise actions have unfortunately been sort of, it's not a legacy that sort of we carried on with us on the Sudanese left, unfortunately. By the time, it's a long history that I go through in the first part of the book, but by the time we get to the Sudanese Revolution of 2018 and 2019, what you have is we don't learn from that question, which is like, okay, we can't just concentrate on the revolution specifically and just have like a broad church approach about who, everyone can come in and kumbaya and all that kind of stuff. We need to look more into like, how do we engage the working classes and so on and so forth and blah, 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 blah. Instead, what we had was there was an over determination and reliance on sort of like the NGO sector. And in our countries, I'm sure in West Asia and North Africa,
Yes.
The UN and like the GIZ, the British Council, name it,
Yes.
the French, whatever equivalent of them, they are like, I say this, and I think this is actually the most accurate description of them. They are the worst for the jobs that they claim to want to do, which is like
So
educate
true.
people, vocational training. But on the other hand, they are the greatest force that sort of absorbs revolutionary energy and kills it. That's literally,
Yes.
they are
Yes.
perfect at that.
That's why they're counterinsurgent. They just suck
1,000.
all the energy and locate it at this, and under the guise of helping, doing something, building, so on.
Yeah, for sure. And I think to relate it to the national question, and you're absolutely right. Like, they come in, I don't know how it is in Lebanon, but like they come in and they have like these ambitious goals that you're like, oh,
Woo.
yeah, who could say no to this, like crazy,
with only
crazy
the
things.
ego of an imperious, colonizer. Come in. Let me tell you all the things we can do. Yes.
Yeah, for sure. Like, I don't know, like the amount of confidence one must have to suggest that,
Oof.
I don't know, we're going to, I don't know, like create like 100% literacy in like a country that's been devastated by the Zionist entity. I don't know what kind of confidence or delusion, but anyways, they have these ambitious goals. And I think the ambitious goals are not there for them to be fulfilled, but are there to attract these revolutionaries. You know what I mean? And that's the problem with it, is when you have a nationalist sort of outlook and a nationalist sort of vision of liberation, then you get boiled down insular into like, okay, how do we help Sudan? And what we need to do for Sudan, we need to educate, we need to like provide. It's always Orientalist things. If you read between the lines, it's like, oh, we need to educate women because Sudanese men are like sort of like this and that, and like they're oppressed. And like it's always like these sort of like kind of like very interesting initiatives.
Yeah.
But then when you have a nationalist sort of outlook, you go like, well, okay, we need to help Sudan, and these are the people who can help us, and so on and so forth. But if you have a more class-oriented, perspective of liberation and so on and so forth, what you see is like, well, these people have been here for a while, and they represent, the interest of like, the IMF, the World Bank, and they even finance through like various sort of financial mechanisms, like the money we even have to pay back in a future date, and like it, sort of inflates the it doesn't matter, like it gets into like these things. And so this is where sort of nationalism, to answer your question in like a long way, nationalism sort of stifled the revolution, because then when you have like this, like I said, you sort of a nationalist worldview, you sort of rely on these initiatives which are like supposed to help Sudan, and unfortunately they were sort of the counterinsurgency, like you were saying. They're the people who sort of basically sold Sudan out. You know what I mean? Those ones who like sort of facilitated the negotiation between the RSF and the military, even though without us, there wouldn't have been like the overthrown of like the 30-year dictatorship, and as long as dictatorship in Africa, and so on and so forth. Without us, this wouldn't have been possible. But we weren't even allowed into the negotiating table. And one time they asked us, right? They're like, okay, why don't you guys come and negotiate and stuff like this, like the resistance committee. This is such a telling anecdote. When we went there, we had just one condition, which is, because we didn't know what was happening, we wanted to be just for everyone. We wanted to be transparent, so we wanted to have it like on like Facebook Live in the negotiations, right? Which is like, it's not a radical demand or whatever, it's just transparent. And they were like, yeah, fuck no, dude. Like, when there's no way that's happening. And so, like, this is just an anecdote to show you that, like, they attract this sort of revolutionary energy, and they sort of destroy it. But maybe I'll stop there, and we can go a little bit more to detail.
No, that's a really, I found that to be really interesting, because we know that there were so many, I mean, and you document this through your own work, like mutual aid efforts and people sort of really helping each other. But you can start to see how over time, and this is what consolidates with the nationalist discourse, that these NGOs come in and capture that and slowly pick off people who have found ways to take care of each other outside of the systems and the parameters of these larger structures and organizations, right? You develop ways of care, you develop or redevelop, or like you were saying before, you lean into social relations and you develop networks of care that don't have to rely on these structures. And then these NGOization, you know, this sort of like black hole comes in and starts sucking people up and selling them the idea that this is going to be actually better. This is going to be easier. Look at all the, you know, and people get, that's the thing. It's a war of attrition. People get tired, and it starts sort of pulling them away from that. I wanted to ask, before we go into psychotherapy praxis, because I want to make sure to get into that, you know, you and I know this answer, but I want to put a very fine point on it. What does anti-communism have to do with this? Because you're talking about how this sort of revolutionary idea that's non-nationalistic and more about, hey, let's not like rely on an organization. We need to work with the poor, with the working class, with the agrarian population, with women. He becomes a problem. They concoct an entire story to take the Communist Party out of sort of commission, and then gets assassinated, right? So for me, this is the story of anti-communism. But maybe you can localize for folks how anti-communism specifically in Sudan creates that sort of bedrock up to the revolution, where this then gets, again, neutralized, right? These communist ideas get neutralized again.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is here, I think, just to follow it up from what I was saying before. Abdul Khalik Mahjoub's initiative of like not concentrating solely or like primarily or exclusively on the national question, but actually concentrating, like what you said, on like women movements and the student movements and the agrarian poor and so on and so forth, like being present there, doing things there, and like, you know, sort of cultivating a base there basically, and, you know, being part of that, right? This was extremely successful at a certain time. So the Sudanese Communist Party was even more, like, was one of the most successful communist parties in West Asia and North Africa.
Yeah,
perhaps second to Iraq, but it was so successful considering Sudan was actually neglected purposefully by the USSR. So it didn't get support, even though even then it was like a very significant, like, you know, movement. So Abdul Khaliq's sort of insights, Abdul Khaliq Mahjoub's insights into this was very, very sort of spot on. It was hard work, of course. I don't want to romanticize it. It wasn't just like thing, but they put in effort, and, you know, it paid off. And so there was there's the success, for example, and, you know, the antagonism that came after independence. He was so accurate in sort of predicting it, because immediately after independence, you know, a certain, you know, party comes into, which is one of these nationalist parties that he sort of broke from, because he said like they're elites and like they represent elite interests and so on and so forth. As soon as they didn't get their way, they literally, and, you know, there was elections, like, okay, so this party is called the Ummah Party. It sort of won elections in the first parliamentary period of Sudan. And, you know, sort of, you know, there was a mass movement between another liberal party under Al-Azhari and another sort of elite party. And it was about to be taken over sort of like electorally. And what the Ummah Party does, which is the one that sort of Abdul Khaliq Mahjoub splits from, because they thought they represented elite interest, what it does, it's literally hands over like power and reign to Aboud, which is the Sudan's first dictatorship. So he, like, of course, he didn't warn about, like, the dictatorship itself and so on and so forth. But he said this is the dangers of, like, engaging with these elites. Abdul Khalik Mahjoub, sorry, not Abdul Khalik Mahjoub. Abud, like the first dictatorship, basically, immediately what it did was bring in the sort of not the was it Eisenhower doctrine? Is it the Eisenhower? I think it's the Eisenhower doctrine, but basically call in sort of U.S. support in military and in economy directly to oppose the communists, the USSR spread. There was no USSR spread, and in fact, the USSR at that time, a little bit later on, sort of, was somewhat cautious to deal with Sudan because it didn't want to dilute its focus with, like, Jamal Abdel Nasser later on, and so on and so forth. There was no threat of, like, the USSR sort of having like any meaningful threat. I mean, this was sort of a national sort of, like, whatever.
All you have to do is whisper USSR to the United States, then they're like, we're on it, we're there. Whether or not they're actually there doesn't matter. Like you're saying.
For sure, and 100%. I think this is what you said in the question, and I think I 100% agree.
Yeah.
Which is this is the anti-communist propaganda, which is like, when we say anti-communist propaganda, I think people might assume that it's, maybe not the audience, but generally, people might assume that it's a capitalist versus a communist sort of fight. No, it's just like you said, Lara. The slightest whisper is like, oh, there's a communist over there. There's a communist under your bed, as the 1990s.
Exactly.
And then you see, like, this sort of military campaigns on, like, coordinations and, like, the spread of, like, military bases and, like, rhetoric around that, and all these kinds of horrific things happening. And this is how basically it started off in Sudan, with the first dictatorship, which came about with the warning of, like, Abdul Khalik Mahjoub. And then later on, sort of, this dictatorship justified the coming of the US aid and stuff, the US aid, not US aid, the thing, but the aid from the US, basically by criminalizing the Communist Party of Sudan. It had to be clandestine, it had to go on the ground. And in their underground work, they still maintain that sort of spirit of, like, being with the working poor, being with, like, these different movements. And sort of it became more and more popular. And then after the collapse of the dictatorship of Aboud, they sort of came back up again, and, sort of almost victoriously in some sense, they carried on what is known as the October Revolution in the 1960s. There were luminaries of this revolution, the communists, right? I mean, you're talking about a communist party that was so demonized for, like, a long period after independence. But because they were in the working class, when they were allowed to participate in electoral politics again, they sort of got, I think it was something like 12% of the vote, and, like, the places that they participated in. For a clandestine party, that's a crazy huge number. That's really impressive. And a party that didn't have the legacy of, like, I don't know, like, this sort of, the liberal sort of, we've established the country of Sudan by, but no, it had, like, a working class sort of orientation. But anti-communism, this is, like, the first period of anti-communism, and then when it came to power, it was sort of, it was a turbulent period. During the second parliamentary period of Sudan, or the second electoral period of Sudan. And then sort of later on, there's another dictatorship by the name of Numeri who came in, who was a sort of a national socialist, or a socialist of the Nasserite type. And when Numeri came in, basically they had, like, a huge, because the communists had, like, an internationalist orientation, and, like, they thought, like, this top-down sort of Nasserite, I don't know, like, Arab socialism and stuff like this. They said it wasn't. It was contradictory, because you're pushing something onto the people, and, like, we need to be it needs to be more democratic and, more inclusive, and so on and so forth. So there was a rift between them, and then part of the Communist Party tried to overthrow the dictatorship, Numeri, and this is basically when Numeri came in and executed
Right.
all the top brass and like thousands of communists across Sudan, and you know, this was basically the death of the left movement in Sudan.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the crackdown. I mean, this is the thing that's important for us to think about. And I don't know, I wanted very specifically to locate this history in Sudan because it gets lost in all the conversation that we talk about, the rich history of communist organizing that like only racists are like surprised by, of course, because that's back to your point of Islamist, like all these like that's the prevailing sort of idea, which of course we know from our entire region, the sort of narrative, the imperial and orientalist narrative that comes in, but to think about the conditions and the processes that brought this to a halt. Now, of course, we see it re-emerge in a different configuration with the revolution. And this is maybe where we can go into the psychotherapy practice. So for folks here, Mohamed is also a practicing clinician, so you can understand how excited I am that I have an anti-imperialist sort of Marxist class-based analysis and therapy involved in a book. So you can get this, and this is like, and you go into it in the second part of the book where you talk about how in the revolution you start to forge what you call a psychotherapy praxis, that it emerges as part of the revolutionary process, which I think ties into what we were just saying. Again, how conditions bring us into being. Like, I love how you said this was not my plan. Like, I didn't plan to do this, but it's a good way to say, like, yeah, I think when we give ourselves over to a process that's emerging and constantly coming into being rather than the foreclosure, something like this happens. And here you are, you find yourself becoming a therapist in the midst of all this in a revolutionary, uprising. So maybe you can like give folks a little attention to that, and then what you mean by psychotherapy praxis. Like, how does this come to be forged through the revolution that's happening in Sudan at the time?
Absolutely. I mean, I think just to emphasize the points that you made, like whether when we look at things in like a sort of like an Orientalist lens, we don't only just miss out the important details, but we miss quite important things. I mean, like honestly, I'm somewhat baffled that there isn't like a major work done on Abdul Khaliq Mahjoub, who basically already solved a problem like that, Frantz Fanon sort of speculated about. He was already solving it when Fanon was like speculating over. You know what I mean? That's an impressive feat, and it's a problem that we face today in the sense that we see today it manifesting like the better of two evils, right? Which is like, should we vote for Kamala Harris to get rid of Donald Trump and all that kind of stuff, right? He back then he was talking about it like it's not about immediately getting independence, but rather we need to like do. And of course, I mentioned a little bit about the Black radical tradition and stuff like that. But like this is what you miss out when you have like these orientalizing narratives and so on and so forth. For the practice of psychotherapy, I got into it almost by accident, like you said.
As all good things.
Exactly. A friend of mine asked me for advice about a certain case of a relative of theirs, and I sort of like advised him about you need to do this and maybe you need to do that within like reason, because like the resources in Sudan are like limited. Their resources like to have access to certain antipsychotic drugs are also limited financially and stuff like this. And so, I told him, generally, okay, if we can't pursue this route, maybe we need to look at it from this perspective, and this is what the literature says, and blah, 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 just regular things. And then my friend was like, oh, this is actually quite sort of helpful for me. And someone else, I told them about you, and they want to like sort of have like ask you questions about certain things. I'm like, yeah, sure, of course, all that kind of stuff. And then slowly, like through name recognition and all that kind of stuff, like people started coming on. And what I've sort of, how practice psychotherapy itself came about is, at the time I was more partial towards like the humanist tradition, the person-centered tradition. For folks who might not know what that is, it's just basically, it's in the psychotherapeutic world. It's like a tradition where sort of it centers the person and what they have to say, and what their experiences are, and then in the therapeutic process, when they're sort of recollecting, their past, it's being recollected in the moment, and so the insight sort of unpack itself in the moment in the form of recollection, because memory is conceptualized as a present phenomena, not something of not something in the past, blah blah blah, stuff like this basically. But another aspect of generally the humanist tradition is like it has like a nature of man that's sort of good, like man is naturally good and all that kind of stuff. And I think during there was
forget
also
about
the behavior.
Forget about power, right? We don't need to just focus on the client. No power here.
Exactly, 100%. And I think, like I said this before, but like during a revolutionary moment, you're obviously in conflict. Like you're in a moment of like direct conflict, right? I mean, yeah, if someone comes up to you and goes like, in one of the cases I talk about is like a little bit of a disclosure. This is going to be a little bit graphic, but in one of the cases that I talk about is one of my clients was just driving around some of these roads in Khartoum, gets stopped over by the police, and essentially he gets raped basically, and
right.
In that moment, right, it's not, of course, yes, the happening of what's like the rape itself, the violence itself is something that you explore and so on and so forth.
By a police officer, right? Or
by a police officer, exactly,
officer,
exactly,
right.
exactly, 100%, Laura, 100%. In that moment, you can't sort of abstract away the context, because the police literally now they sort of see any urban dweller who's in their 20s as representative of sort of this, resurgence of revolutionary energy. And so their sort of immediate antagonism towards them is because of like just like viewing them in a certain light. You know what I mean? And then the act of, sort of penetration itself, it's an act of violence, and it represents something. And all this sort of maybe psychoanalytical, maybe historical, maybe, political context is really important to understand it. So to say that, in the moment, to be like, there's a natural goodness in human beings, it just, it's a profoundly poor definition of like the ontology of man, or the ontology of humans, because you're looking at ontology as anthropocentric. You're like, okay, since people forever used to be social, you're sort of mistaken ontology with anthropology a little bit. You know what I mean? It's not. It doesn't thing it, but it's something that I found personally that's unhelpful in the practice. And behaviorist, the behaviorist approach was a little bit too mechanicistic and sort of reliant on way too many different sort of prosthetics and stuff like this, that it just, I don't like it personally. You can maybe hear it from my tone, and from Laura's face
you're
as well.
You're in good company here. I think we're in good company, not to like the behaviorists. Yes.
But yeah, and so in the moment, I was obviously doing political work as well, and like reading things in politics and political philosophy and all that kind of stuff. And I could not help but notice that basically, in order to have a meaningful connection with someone, during a revolution, it cannot be abstracted from the history, from the politics, and from these kind of contexts. And so this was when sort of when I sort of seen it like, or doing like the praxis or developing this psychotherapeutic modality, linking it to like to the current moment. And maybe we'll get into this in the next question, but for example, one of the things that was very puzzling to me when it comes to like the psychological literature was that there was only one book published about the relationship between psychology and critical realism, which for me was very important to even understanding, to knowing what we know, to understand social ontologies and so on and so forth. And I it's something that I sort of try to incorporate into practice psychotherapy, and I think it was quite helpful. Yeah, at least for the cases that I had.
Yeah, one of the things you said, and this is the quote I like, so Mohamed says, talking about praxis psychotherapy is it's a therapy anchored in critical realist theory. And I wonder if you can sort of talk to people more about what that means. Like, what does that look like? You've gotten to it a little bit, but maybe like, use one of the clinical examples you have. So it's the book is, as anybody who knows me, the folks who are here a lot of the time, anything that's Fanon-like. So there is a Fanon-like quality to, you actually mentioned this. You said in Wretched of the Earth, Fanon gives us these, case studies. Of course, later in 2019, we get his actual clinical papers and we see even more studies. But this section of your book does go into it. So as you talk about the theory of praxis psychotherapy, you're also operationalizing it and sort of animating it with these stories and case studies. And what I like about it is that you don't just give a clinical picture, you also then bring us back to the historical. You're like, here's the historical pieces that are tied into this. Here's the moment in time that this happened. Here are the, these sort of entry points to the familial dynamics, to the particular individual wounding, whatever they're coming to ties into this, and this. The case you were just talking about the man who was raped by the police officer is a moment that you also explicitly say, this is the direct link to the sexual violence that we're seeing in the Zionist entity, right? It's about humiliation. Yes. It's about power. It's about, like you said, who these people represent, like both in terms of like the militants who they represent, but then also representatives of the state and your ability to use that power to discipline people. And this is a carceral discipline. Somebody talked about drop tip of the spear in our chat, which of course Ori's work comes in here as well, about managing people, power sort of being involved in this carceral discipline, and the ways that the state mobilizes all its arms to do this. Yeah. So that's what I got that, and in reading your cases, like they were not disconnected from this stuff. And it wasn't like, let me tell you the history and then let me tell you the case study, which is a lot of how psychological, work is written. It was more so, no, there's a seamlessness to this. But maybe for the audience in our last, 10 minutes or so, you can sort of use a case or talk a little bit more about what you mean about critical realism, that this is grounded in critical realism.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and especially like when I did talk about, I do mention how like the prisoners in Palestine, and especially that prisoner that yes. sort of succumbed to his sort of tortured wounds of being raped, basically in Israeli prison. Like how this sort of is, you cannot see this, and I'm sort of almost, you're almost surprised by how can you see this outside of politics. But it is, for example, what my motivation was to bringing critical realism into the mix was, okay, where do we sort of stop? Like, there is a political context, and there's also an individualized sort of yeah. bespoke sort of reality, you know what I mean, or like perception or whatever it is, perception of reality. Where do we separate the lines, and how do we merge them together? Now, when we talk, and in order for me to understand this, I brought in critical realism, because when we look at, which is critical realism is a philosophy of science and other sort of ways of understanding things, but mainly it's a philosophy of science that sort of critiques empiricism and hermeneutics, and it's sort of foundationally, there's 3 pillars of it, like, which is ontological realism, epistemological relativism, and what's it called, judgmental rationalism. I mean, these maybe I'll let people go for it in their spare time to see what it is, but basically what I try to do here is use this because it sort of solves the problem of like, okay, where does the personal and where does the political sort of merge, and how do we understand reality in relation to us? So basically, there is obviously a reality that exists outside of us, but we also reproduce ourselves in this reality, through this reality. We have a relationship to this reality. And critical realism, what it does is, for example, when in its critique of like empiricism, it says that, and hermeneutics, or like let's say post-structuralism today, it critiques it by saying that both these classical traditions, they sort of merge, like, you know, the ontology of humans and the ontology of society into one another. So, you know, it's always like, does man reproduce society, or does society reproduce man? And it sort of like mixes these two together, you know, completely. But what Roy Pascal, or like the sort of innovator of this mode is, it separates, for example, society by itself, and, you know, man and or humans by themselves, and man reproduce, or humans reproduce themselves, reproduce society through reproducing themselves through society. It gets a little bit technical, but basically the reason why I bring this in is so I can understand basically where do I stop. Like you can't sort of dilute the personal experience completely with just the political while disregarding what's going on personally. But simultaneously, you can't take someone's perspective and sort of dilute the political context to the point where, you know, it becomes like just a relation, an imagination, or like a psychotic relationship with how we understand reality. And so by bringing in this theory, basically I say, or, you know, in this practice of psychotherapy, I say that there is already an existing reality in which we enter into, but this reality we may never know, but we construe. And different construals of this reality have heavier sort of epistemic weight. You know, so for example, let's say, as a matter of fact, the sky is blue, right? Now, if Lara says, for example, the sky is purple, and I say, no, the sky is black, she would have more epistemic weight in her construal of what the sky is, because they're separate ontologically from her, and or society is separated from her, and so on and so forth. Or the sky is separated from her, and so on and so forth, and from me. So that's just laying the ground fund, the basis of critical realism, and practice psychotherapy in relation to critical realism. And it's important to bring it back to your question, Lara, which is, it's important because, you know, we have these case studies and people going through, to use the example of the person who was raped by the police, you know, okay, this person has reacted to this, what has happened to them, in a certain way, through being recluse, through focusing more psychically onto other things, through doing different, whatever it is. During the psychotherapeutic process, you don't determine what is going on, but you sort of have, you sort of allow the person to have a construal of what has happened. And this construal is informed by the therapist and the client's understanding of reality, if that makes sense. So a good example would be, I don't know, let's say this particular person, and I come and say, for example, the Sudanese Revolution is like this, and, you know, this happened in the Sudanese Revolution, everything that we said just now. And then during the moment, we start talking about the paramilitaries and the military forces and the police force and their role in maintaining sort of peace and order, for example, and the prison system, and, you know, how the police sees themselves as, like, you know, basically the containing, or like, you know, the maintaining of like a nation. Yeah, a guardian and stuff like this. And then the person would be like, yeah, actually, you know what? During the incident, when it was happening, the person did this, or like when they stopped me, they explicitly asked me this particular question about like whether I was part of the revolution or not. And so what happens is you sort of lay out historically what's going on, and in so doing, and obviously with the client, and you know, trying to understand these things and giving them room, the client sort of points directly to something that was said and it was exchanged, and says how this particular phenomenon relates to their personal experience in that moment in this way. And from there, you sort of find, basically, you get into like the richness of, the relationship between the therapy and the client. And yeah, basically, there's a process called emergence, but let's not get into it.
But the important thing that you're talking about is you're not running away. I think there are ways that this sort of liberal humanist discourse of therapies is that like somehow there's no such thing as non-negotiables. Like part of what you're saying is there's a non-negotiable backdrop against which we all live. The Sudanese Revolution is happening. This is the way the structure is. This is the infrastructure. This is the history from which it comes. And that acknowledgement, rather than foreclose possibilities of exploration, actually opens up possibilities. So, it's sort of just right away, praxis psychotherapy is saying, fuck this neutrality bullshit. This is not reality. That's reality bending, actually. And one of the ways you can sort of get it to different layers or textures of being and create a dynamic that is meaningful, not predetermined, but meaningful, is by immediately recognizing what were the infrastructure that both of us are in and what our world is saturated by.
No, absolutely, 100%. Like especially the part that you said about the human as sort of trying to keep this neutrality, which is it's just so like it's so quite outrageous, right? Like I also like this is sort of where I studied this. This was what I was taught in, and whenever I was in class and like listening to people talking about this, it's just so it's so violent to process.
It is violent, yes. Yes.
You know what I mean? It's such a crazy, because even in any context, right, there's definitely power relations going on. There's obviously like a historic backdrop and so on and so forth. And to be like, oh yeah, tell me more. And like, I'm holding, like you're going to be sort of, because we're pro-social and pro-good and stuff like this, by allowing you the space, you get to activate your self-actualization stuff. What the fuck are you talking about, bro? Like honestly.
And we'll determine if racism exists or not just through exploration. It might not.
What the fuck? It's so weird. It's so bizarre, and it opens up. I don't know how they mitigate this, honestly. And this is like maybe a problem with like liberal pluralism and stuff like this. What if there's an oppositional force that says, well, actually, yeah, I'm a Nazi, and actually Nazism deserve the right to, like, exactly. What the fuck? What? This is so crazy. Like, it's so,
That's why they come undone. It stops there. They're just like, I don't know what the fuck to do. They like short circuit.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. 100%. Yeah.
Well, Mohamed, I'm so delighted to be introduced to your work, to be able to have this conversation with you. To learn more about Sudan, to go into the history, to fortify our struggles and our solidarity, our peoples, like you said, to see the similarities, honestly, structurally, about what happens, irrespective of the specificities, the geographic specificities and all that, the logics that cut across. That has been just wonderful. Is there anything else you would leave our listeners with? In the show notes is Mohamed's website for psychotherapy. I hear that you're starting up psychotherapy practice again. So folks, if you're looking for somebody, and check out the website. I dropped it. I'll drop it again now. And but is there anything else that you would leave the audience with, and where they can find you, what's going on?
I mean, first of all, thank you a lot for having me, and I couldn't agree more. Like, I'm so glad to be here, and honestly, this is one of the first platforms that I thought about. Like, it just directly sort of fits in with the psychology and the anti-imperialism and the Marxism and stuff like this. So, like, thank you for having me. And I think, I'm so glad that, hopefully we can be in community and in communication and, in dialogue and all that kind of stuff. For many people, I think maybe, at the moment, people are looking to like understand what's going on in Sudan, and they see the images, like I said earlier, and what can we do and stuff like this. And I think the first thing I would say is, and this is not to desensitize, but we have to, because the media has put an image in Sudan as like this sort of in a certain light. And I think the first thing that we need to do is just like denaturalize this. And I would say pick up the book. And I'm not even saying, like, for those people who, you know, not even saying it to a thing, the book is for free on PDF on the website. You know what I mean? It's not even self-advertisement. But of course, if you want to help a brother out, you know, by all means. But like, just we need to understand what's going on in Sudan and just be educated about it. So, you know, if you can't afford it, there's a PDF online. You can get access to it. And, you know, please. I think a lot of people there's a huge appetite for it, and, you know, spread the word, and, you know, let's try to be internationalist in that sense, and hopefully a better future.
Absolutely. Like this stream, send it to a friend, send it to a comrade, send it to your therapist, send it to an enemy, whoever you send it to. Make sure you spread the word. Muhammad, شكرا كتير, يعطيك ألف عافية. It's my pleasure, حبيبي. تحيا السودان إن شاء الله we get to visit together خيي.
inshallah. I love that. And وكمان لبنان إن شاء الله.
عندك بيت whenever you're there. عندك بيت.
Oh, that'd be so good. I'm gonna take you up on that, by the way.
Of course.
Nice.
Of course.
Lana, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. We're going on a little bit of a hiatus. We'll be back in a couple weeks, and I'll see you soon. But I'll still be releasing some audio content, so make sure you look out for that. Thank you so much, everybody.